Yeah. At 12:30. So.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? What? Testing, testing. All right, thank you, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about medical errors and high reliability organizations. And I gave a version of this talk a couple years ago to this group and then several other organizations. And at that time, I prefaced it by saying that I do have some experience in error reduction and high reliability as a trainer, but I don't want to proclaim that full disclosure that I'm somehow, an expert in errors and high reliability. I'm maybe more of a dedicated student and perhaps a good messenger. So I'll do my best. There may be some in the room who are much more experienced than I am, but we'll go ahead and share everything I can. Now, the purpose of this talk is several-fold. One is that a few years ago, maybe some of you might recall, that we really wanted to look at how the commission itself can become a high reliability organization. And we went through some iterations of exercises to try to figure out what that might look like. And some of that work did go through, and Melanie and her team implemented a lot of things that really has helped us in that direction of producing, creating a just culture and high reliability and reducing bias and those things. But also, we as a medical commission, in doing the work that we do, is there a way that we can look at errors, medical errors, in a different way that we might consider and we actually take action when there's complaints, and how we want to help our respondents. Traditionally, I think the public, and even maybe some of those of you in this room, and the commissioners who have come and gone, might have seen the commission as a heavy hand, the referees, the police, who look at things that have gone wrong and punish physicians and PAs for things that they've done wrong or errors and so forth. And I think as we learn more about the science behind errors, and we look at how to improve the integrity of our profession and the safety of our patients, it's a different way of looking at it. I think we need to kind of emphasize that. So now that we have a whole group of new commissioners and staff, I think it would be a good idea for us to review some of this. So as we go through this, we're going to try to dissect a little bit into the science of errors and high reliability organizations. Hopefully that'll bring some interesting discussions. So the purpose of, again, this talk is to get a better understanding of medical errors and develop processes with a just culture that will help us reduce errors, discuss how the Washington Medical Commission might consider cases that involve medical errors. And we'll touch a little bit about the concept of CRP, or Communication Resolution Program, and managing and reducing medical errors. So let me start by discussing a case. So some of you are familiar with this case. This was a case back in 1995, and probably the case that was that really brought forth the idea of medical errors into the public spotlight. And this was the case that where the wrong leg was amputated. And those of us who are in medicine, of course, we see errors all the time. But this was the one that I think was was highlighted, at least in the public eye. This is a patient who was a 52-year-old male with diabetes. He was scheduled for a right below the knee amputation, but the surgeon ended up left leg. Now, there were many other things that happened that day. The scheduler listed the wrong side. The wrong side was written on the board. Also, the wrong foot was equally diseased and was probably needing medication at some point eventually. But nonetheless, the side that was scheduled was the right side. The wrong foot was already prepped when the patient entered the room. And those of you who are not familiar with the OR environment, especially in those days, we didn't have like checklists and pauses and timeouts and all that. A lot of times the patients wouldn't prep them ready to go, and then the OR scrubs comes in. And, so the surgeon was informed of the wrong side mid-surgery. The nurse was extremely upset and was in tears. But of course, by then it was too late. The patient eventually received a $1.2 million settlement. And interestingly, when you look at how errors are typically managed, we think of errors as it's pretty straightforward. It's a human error, human mistakes. And typically, if you want to categorize it the way you look at this, the person who's closest in time and space to the incident are usually the one who's held responsible, especially if they could have done something different at the last minute to achieve a different outcome. So, of course, in this case, the surgeon, who happened to be the one who was the closest to the patient and was holding the scalpel as the scalpel cut through the patient's skin, was the one who was identified to be the responsible one. And then once you identify that responsible person, then that's the end of the case. You either punish that person, or you might teach them something new or whatever. So that's how, most of the time we deal with errors, even in our daily lives or professional lives or whatever. And of course, we'll dive a little bit deeper into that. So how did they respond to this case? The Florida Board of Medicine suspended his license for 6 months and fined him $10,000 required of education and risk management. They also wanted to send a message to the media and to the public that it was doing its job in protecting the public. But unfortunately, when you really look at this from an error prevention perspective, it perpetuated a common misconception about the causality of errors and reinforced what physicians can expect from future errors. As we'll dive into a little bit more deeper, errors are not something that individuals can expect to prevent. And now all it does is that it perpetuates the idea that physicians are, held to the standard where they cannot make any mistakes, and if you do, you're going to be punished. And of course, at that time, there wasn't really a lot more that just like the Washington Medical Commission, there wasn't really much more that the Board of Medicine could do other than that it could kind of deliver this message. See, we picked out bad doctors and now we're punishing them for doing our job. But of course, as most people have already now recognized, people who make mistakes like this surgeon was a skilled surgeon. He'd been in practice for 20 years or something, and nobody actually wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to make a mistake today. In fact, we do everything we can to avoid mistakes. You remember the famous crash of two jumbo jets on the island of Tenerife. The KLM pilot who made the mistake of taking off in the fog and crashing into the other jumbo jet. You know, he was their top pilot. You couldn't get more senior than this person. In fact, he was the one who was on all of their ads, and he was the one who was training all of their pilots. And so, you know, just educating and you know, training people is not really the solution to this. But of course, more recent, and I'm using the patient's names to describe the cases. So the first one is a patient named King. This is a patient named Murphy. This just happened this past year, where a nurse was convicted of making a mistake. 75-year-old patient was prescribed a sedative for an MRI scan. The nurse intended to retrieve Versed, so she typed in VE into the medicine cabinet. You guys are familiar with that. Selected the first item on the list, which happened to be vacuronium, and so when she administered, obviously the patient died, and so the prosecution argued that the nurse ignored various warnings and acted recklessly. Defense argued that systems have flaws that cause well-intended individuals to make mistakes. Of course, that's the common belief in American science. And that she was eventually convicted of gross neglect of an impaired adult and negligent homicide. Fortunately, the judge decreased her sentence so that she didn't have to put prison time, but she's still been now under probation, and she's been convicted of a homicide, which I think is pretty severe for somebody who obviously did not intend to make a mistake or harm anyone. And I'm not bringing this up to make a comment about the justice system, but really more about how can we learn from these lessons to apply them in our practice of our commission, of the commission. So just to go back in history a little bit, of course, everyone's familiar with this. This is the famous landmark publication that came from the Institute of Medicine to Care is Human that described that almost 100,000 deaths per year is caused by medical errors at a cost of multiple billions of dollars. They actually recognized in that study that errors are caused by faulty systems, and recommended a four-tiered approach to decrease the errors, including some of these concepts that are now considered pretty normal these days. It's creating a culture of safety, etc. So the medical error is described as the failure of a planned action to be completed as intended, or the use of a wrong plan to achieve an aim. So we'll dive into that a little bit. Now the government acted very quickly. They said, okay, let's put some money into this. Let's figure out how we can reduce errors. The medical community pushed back really hard. I mean, the most famous and powerful physician leaders across the nation really pushed back and say, well, that can't be true. We can't be making that many errors, or some of these errors are not preventable. Some of these just occur. I don't think physicians really had an understanding of error science back then. They just assumed that if they were doing their job well, that you're not making errors. Now, medical errors, if you were to put it in the list of causes of death, according to the CDC, it would be number 3, and perhaps even higher if you were to include errors that are caused as an outpatient. So, a number of patient safety examples of harm. I'm not going to read through all of these. These have been all published. 10 sentinel events in 2018, so-called the never events, unintended retained foreign objects, falls, wrong side procedures, delay in treatment, patient suicide, which is an interesting thing to consider as a sentinel event that could be preventable, medication management, etc. Inpatient harm, typically medication errors, infections. Now, when these lists came out, again, there was a lot of pushback saying, well, these aren't errors, these are just things that happen, and then some of them are not preventable. And actually, the evidence would show that, in fact, the majority of these are preventable, and they do occur due to some sort of a oversight or an error in the ambulatory setting, and medication errors, diagnostic errors, etc. Such that healthcare, if you look at the data, we're about as dangerous as mountain climbing and bungee jumping. We're nowhere near what we would consider something that's ultra safe, like these days, airlines and nuclear power. So given that there are these many experiences for patient experiences annually, you can imagine how many errors will actually occur. Now, to continue to talk about errors, let me describe some concepts that we're going to be using for the rest of the talk. I'll just kind of dig a little bit deeper in here. So the science of error reduction includes three major topics. One is high reliability. Second is Six Sigma, which refers to process improvement, and then just culture. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. So Six Sigma is a process improvement technique to improve the quality of the outcome of a process by identifying and removing the causes of defects and minimizing variability. And I'm sure many of you guys are already pretty familiar with this. The science behind this is the idea that when you, the term Six Sigma comes from a statistical terminology where a sigma is the standard deviation from the norm, from the mean. And if you get out to 6 standard deviations, that's very significant. It pretty much is, you can see that by the numbers, how little that the deviations are. So that mathematically, from an error rate, and if you translate the Six Sigma statistically into an error rate, a Six Sigma would mean that you would have basically 3 defects per million observations. Whereas, something that you might think is 99% accurate or reliable is still really only less than 4 sigma, where you're going to see about 6,000 or more defects per million observations. And so if you translate that into something that's more recognizable or tangible, let's say if you're at 99%, so that's about 3.8 sigma, this is what life would look like. You would have these many mistakes being occurring, 20,000 lost pieces of mail per hour, 200,000 wrong drug prescriptions, no electricity for almost 7 hours each month. For 15 minutes every day, your water will be unsafe to drink. Now, obviously, a lot of these things, none of these things are actually happening. So you have to assume, you have to understand that a lot of these processes, including utilities and so forth, have succeeded in becoming better than 99% 3.8 sigma. The Six Sigma state is much more reliable, such that we know that for things like public utilities and airlines and aircraft carriers and nuclear power plants, et cetera, we have achieved to the point where we are at Six Sigma level of reliability. And if you were to compare the Six Sigma or the Sigma level processes, you can see that airline industry has really gotten to that point. Anesthesia is one area that have been able to achieve high reliability, mostly because they were the first to adopt a lot of the standardization checklists and things like that. Whereas medicine is still very far down here, where if you have low back pain, you've got pretty much a 50% chance of getting it right. And that's actually supported by evidence. So you can see that there. So where when it comes to healthcare, you would expect a lot more, but we're not really getting it. So in terms of understanding the errors themselves, so there are 3 different types of errors. This is based on a publication by Rasmussen. So 3 different types of errors that are skill-based, rule-based, and knowledge-based. And these are all variable in terms of how much consciousness decision-making is involved versus what's automatic. So let's have a little fun with this and describe this in here in a little bit more detail. So skill-based errors, these are errors that occur while we do things that are very routine, autopilot. There's very little conscious thought here. So this is be like, when you left the keys in the refrigerator, or you forget to put the milk back in the fridge. And things that you do kind of automatically because you've got this muscle memory, and then something gets distracted, and then you deviate from that subconscious or unconscious level of activity. There's what we call errors of commission, like these are called slips. So this is like, let's say you put you're putting keys in the refrigerator, or lapses of error, which is where you forget to do something, and then also what we call fumbles, which is where you accidentally knock over something because you weren't paying attention. So the interesting thing about the skill-based errors is that approximately 30% of the errors in healthcare are skill-based. And the just try not to forget anything here. And the error rate for humans for a skill-based error is about 0.3%. Now, we usually make about 10,000 skill-based decisions a day. Okay? That means you're making 30 mistakes a day. Now, most of them are not consequential, so it's not like you're, creating harm or losing limbs every day because you're making a mistake, but that's just how we are. So to think that we're going to not make mistakes as humans is really unrealistic expectation. So, here's a way that most of us might experience a potential risk for a skill-based error, and then you try to avoid it. So when you go to let's say you go to a vending machine every day to get your favorite candy, put the money in, and you've only got one chance to get the right candy, right? So as you put in the code, what do? You double check, right? Make sure you're doing the right thing. So we have the ability to do things like double check things to make sure that we're not going to make a skill-based error. Even though it's the same candy that you're getting every day, you still double check. So we can train ourselves to get that level of awareness. And then I can put this in here. The international symbol for a skill-based error is a rule-based error. They occur while you think you're following a rule. So this has a medium level of conscious thought. This is where you apply the wrong rule in a new situation. So you think you know how to do something, but then you're put into a new situation and you end up doing the wrong thing. Or you misidentify a situation as unfamiliar or is familiar, and you try to apply a new rule, and then you end up making a mistake. Or the correct rule is not well understood, and the incorrect answer is thought to be correct. So for example, if I ask you what's the capital of Philadelphia, maybe not this crowd, but
sorry, Pennsylvania. A lot of people might say, oh, it's Philadelphia. And of course, it's, there's our, or if you're skating on ice, you think, oh, I'm skating, the first thing I need to do is put on the brakes. And it just makes it worse. Or a surgeon might transcend the common bile duct, thinking it's a cystic duct. It's a different situation, maybe, the visibility is a little different, but you think you're okay, cystic duct, I'm supposed to cut it, that's the rule, but then you're in a different situation. Most of medical records are actually medical errors, are rule-based, and the way you would avoid a rule-based error is to constantly question it, to have that questioning mind to say, if somebody tells you, well, on Tuesdays we have to do it this way, well, question that. Like, why is that? Why do we do it that way? And then educate yourself, think twice, measure twice, cut once, and continue to reinforce the correct standards. Just want to make sure I want to include these notes. Okay. All right. So the probability of experiencing a rule-based error is about 1 in 100, which is about 1%. A lot of the errors are often due to cognitive dissonance as well. So cognitive dissonance is where you just can't admit to yourself that a mistake had been made, because you just keep telling yourself, nope, it's still right. It's kind of like when you're driving and then that lane's going faster. I'm going to go over there, and you go over there, and all of a sudden it slows down, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to stick to this lane because I'm too proud to admit to myself that I made a mistake. I should go back to the other lane. Nope, I'm going to stick to it. And so, and we do that all the time. And I mean, that's a funny example, but there are more serious examples where we continue to make the same mistake because we just can't admit to ourselves that that the rule that we just follow is not the right one. Knowledge-based errors, of course, this has the highest level of conscious thought. This is where you have you're doing something new and you're not aware of the rules or routines, so you try to figure it out. You're using your mind to say, this is something that I should be able to know how to do, and I try to figure it out. The person lacks experience or knowledge to apply the right solution at the right time, or they lack the experience or the situation to apply the known, the experience of the solution to apply the known solution. So, for example, maybe a student pilot knows how to land a plane, but then when there's a failure, they don't know how to land a plane, and they try to figure it out. Throwing water on a grease fire, that could also be a rule-based error. Or let's say you're a surgeon and you cut a ureter and you think, okay, well, I should be able to figure this out. And you try to figure it out. Problem with that is that most of these decisions that you make in a knowledge-based situation end up being wrong. So you can see, pretty much half of the decisions that you try to make in a knowledge-based situation end up being the wrong decision. And about 15% of the medical errors are knowledge-based. You can probably don't think of, well, I know how to try to do that. Maybe yourself, I've done that in the past. So how do you avoid these errors? You stop when you're unsure, you ask for help, assign mentors, create just cultures so that it's okay to admit that you did something wrong or that there was a mistake, etc. So I just wanted to share that as our background to how we look at errors, so that we go to the next step in terms of how we want to consider medical errors as a commission, keeping that in mind, that it takes more than just applying more CMEs or having them come to the commission and have a come to Jesus moment or whatever. And that's not going to be actually successful in reducing errors. So we talked a little bit about this. So let's go back to the King case with the wrong side amputation, we have to address some of these other factors that led to the wrong side surgery. So, number one, I know some of these sound obvious, but they are all contributors to error, how we make errors. Number one, wrong side risk exists not because humans are making the mistake, but because there's a bilaterality to the human body. We have a left leg, right leg. We have a left eye and a right eye. So we create these defenses to prevent the wrong side selection, such as, well, I'm just going to remember. Well, that may be affected. Or we put it on paper. Okay, or we'll actually go to the patient and now mark it. Now, when I started doing this way before any of this existed, and when the hospital started telling me, okay, you got to start marking the patient, that's so dumb. Why do I have to do that? I can just remember it, and of course, that's how a lot of physicians still think, and so we probably didn't even do it right. In fact, and as you probably remember, well, what do? You just put a check mark? Well, do you put yes or no? Like, yes, this is the side, or yes, this is the side that we keep, or there was a lot of confusion in terms of how we actually wanted to implement this. And then, of course, with timeout. So we put these defenses in to help prevent the errors. And then, so now what causes breakdown of these defenses? Because people are non-compliant, or they think that they don't need it, or that if you need these defenses, then somehow you're deficient. Only dumb people would need something like that. And then error reduction is not just about identifying flawed individuals and then sharing lessons learned, because we all have the ability to make errors, and it does not make us, a better human by proving to others that we're error-free. And that's really what we've expected a lot of physicians, that we've expected the medical profession to get to. Those of us who have been through residency, what was M&M all about? Back in the old days, you'd stand up in front of professors and your colleagues in the big auditorium and say, I made this mistake, I'll never do it again. End of story. That was how we took care of errors, right? By making ourselves better, whether that was actually effective or not. So, and then how an institution responds to the errors will define its transformation to a higher liability organization. So, how does that work? Well, as difficult as it is to admit, systems actually contribute to human error. So, in fact, research shows that outcomes, both good and bad, remember, bad outcomes and good outcomes are basically their artificial judgment, value judgments, right? So, if one person does, if you get a particular outcome, whether that is good or bad, really depends on the person who's defining good or bad. But nonetheless, they flow from not just single points of activity, but from a complex set of factors. And now this quote, I love this quote: human practitioners are not so much the cause of occasional sporadic accidents as they are the active agents that regularly contribute to success. So that when they carry out their goals successfully, they are the creators of safety, and safety research tries to identify factors that undermine the practitioner's ability to do this successfully. So, like for example, as a general surgeon, I like to use this as an example. I'm doing a laparoscopic cholecystectomy. What prevents me from having a mild injury? So you're doing the same thing. Me as a surgeon, I'm doing the same surgery over and over and over again. That same surgery leads to a successful outcome and a complication and failure. I didn't do anything different. It just went different directions. So what actually caused the mild injury? Is that something that Was it external? Was it, was I not paying attention at the particular time? Was there some other external factor that caused it? And how does the organizational response then affect that? So, now many of you probably have seen this model, what we call the sharp end. I'm not going to dig a little that much deep into this, but in terms of processes, you have the blunt end where you have the organizations, institutions, policies, procedures, et cetera, that then gets narrowed down through these constraints that you have with your resources, and et cetera, that then gets funneled into the actual person, the practitioner, and at the sharp end is where we operate. That's where our behavior actually appears. When we, everything that we do, if you want to look at it backwards, everything we do here at the sharp end, at that point where we're making contact with our patients, or when we're, putting the screw into the wall, or whatever we're doing, that is dependent on mindset, knowledge, and goals, and then the resources that allowed us to get to that point, and then the rules and regulations. So everything. So this is a model that describes the blunt end and the sharp end. So when we say sharp end, that's what we're going to be talking about. So, and then this is a famous model for error reduction, Swiss cheese effect, where there's these active barriers that we put in. Each of these slices of cheese is a barrier that we have placed to prevent an error, but there's holes in it. And as those holes line up, eventually we can actually get through all of those, bypass all of those barriers, and lead to an event of harm. And when you were to take, if you were to take an error event, you can usually see where those holes are. All right, so that's error science. Now let's talk a little bit about high reliability organizations. So what are high reliability organizations? When this was written about, originally it was to describe basically three industries: nuclear power plants, aircraft carrier flight decks, and air traffic control. So if you were to look at, let's say, an aircraft carrier flight deck, imagine you've got this highly organized, extremely dangerous situation in a setting where, and I'm not going to read through this, but it essentially says you've got the boat moving around, you've got things that are, need to be timed precisely to the second, and it's all run by, a bunch of teenagers. Like, how do you make this work so that nobody gets hurt? This is like, science of high reliability, perfect example. So what is high reliability? There's 5 principles in high reliability. Preoccupation with failure, and that is to view even near misses and opportunities to improve rather than proof of success. So if you almost made a mistake, don't say, "Ooh, we got there. It's almost." It should be more like, "Well, how did we almost fail?" Reluctance to simplify, and that's the acceptance that every work that you need to look at is complex, and that the potential to fail in new, unexpected ways is always there. We need to pay attention and don't assume that something is going to work the same way every time. Sensitivity to operations. That is the heightened awareness of the state of relevant systems and processes, so that you don't you can't rely on just yourself to think that no matter where I go, I'm going to be able to do it right. So as a surgeon, maybe in one hospital, I might have different results in another. Now we've often pointed that out and said, well, if you can have great outcomes here, why is he having such poor outcomes at this other hospital? And that would show you that there are differences in systems and processes that trigger errors in the same person in the same behavior. into resilience, to prioritize the learnings and deference to expertise. And this really means that we need to make sure that we value the insights from those who are the closest to the action and have the most knowledge, not necessarily the one who has the most seniority. So for example, if you're trying to solve a problem where the floor is slippery and people are falling all the time, you know, the experts in that are probably the people who are, you know, cleaning the floor then, and not the manager or the CEO of the company. Now, the term high reliability organizing is not necessarily, it is really what's more accepted in terms of how you want to change your culture and change your company or your organization so that you can become highly organized or highly reliable. Healthcare is somewhat difficult to become a highly reliable organization because, as I mentioned before, and some of this I know is my opinion, but the culture of medicine tends to blame and shame. There's a huge power differential, particularly between physicians and nurses, or physicians and non-physicians in any hospital setting. And that's actually something that's been studied. I guess the culture and the belief system that physicians have fosters silence even when danger is imminent. So going back to the plane crash, where the most senior pilot in the whole company was actually piloting that flight, the co-pilot actually knew what was going on. And this is in the flight recorder where he actually started to say, "Are you sure we're clear?" And the pilot said, "Don't question me," or something to that effect. "We're leaving now." And the co-pilot was like, "Well, I didn't hear the clearance from the tower yet." There's other problems with the tower because they were speaking a different language and all this kind of stuff. But nonetheless, because of this culture where they couldn't question the pilot, there was no way to pull the brakes. And this happens in the OR quite a bit. We hear these cases where the nurse was sitting there saying, you know, there's a lot of bleeding going on, and maybe the surgeon might say, "Shh, you know, let me focus," or "Don't tell me what to do." And of course, you know, when we talk about plane crashes, we're talking about 500 people dying. You know, in healthcare, it's only one patient at a time, which may minimize the bigger picture for healthcare leaders. In terms of getting to that highly reliable organizing, we still have ways to go. Healthcare sort of moved in waves where we went through technical advancements, improved surgical techniques, etc. And we started to standardize procedures. We're sort of still living in that area. But the next level of organizing a wave of innovation that will help us reduce mortality rates would be to implement high reliability into systems. So what are some of these examples of these 5 principles? I think we've talked a little bit about some of these failure mode effects analyses. And I use the term celebrating errors here. Now I know that some of you have talked to me about feeling a little uncomfortable using the word celebrate. So I leave that in there because I want you to feel a little bit uncomfortable. That what does that mean? Like when an error is made that we're going to have a party? No. But I want us to think about if you make an error, we should bring it, you know, put it in the spotlight, bring it forth and bring it in front of everybody, and to some extent, show appreciation to the individual who made the mistake. They were able to bring this to the attention of those who can actually address the error, because if it wasn't that person, somebody else would have made the mistake later. Reluctance to simplify because of analyses, optimizing your EHRs so that you're continuing to look at how we can standardize our order sets, sensitivity to operations, resilience, and deference to expertise. Of course, we talked about a lot of these things already. And I'm going to skip that slide because it's kind of an eye chart. So high reliability organizing tools at the sharp end, these are behaviors that we can all adopt. Pay attention to detail, communicate clearly, have a questioning attitude, operate as a team, and speak up for safety. The third component of high reliability or error reduction, just culture in medicine. A just culture is a culture that is open, transparent, supportive, and committed to learning. A culture that's based on teamwork and mutual respect, where every voice is heard and every worker is empowered to prevent system breakdowns and correct them before they occur, where patients and families are fully engaged in their care, and where caregivers share information openly about hazards, errors, and adverse events. So this is actually from our document, by the way. So we have to recognize that through a just culture model, error reduction cannot be, system-based errors can't be addressed by blaming the individual. And I'm really excited that more and more, as we see complaints come through that were the results of respondent errors, that somebody always says, well, what were the system-based factors that caused the error? And we've had plenty of conversations about different examples like that. So, for example, a few years ago, we had a case that was in panel A where an anesthesiologist, and this was one of our CRP cases, an anesthesiologist at the end of the case, they were overseeing residents as well, stepped out of the room as the patient was getting mobilized and moved to the bed so that they can wheel them out of the OR. During that time, and while the patient was being moved, the circuit got disconnected. The patient, I don't know all the details exactly, but the patient started to become hypoxic, and by the time the anesthesiologist came back into the room, the resident and the rest of the team were trying to resuscitate. The patient eventually died. So, do we blame somebody? I think our usual response is that something goes wrong, we need to blame somebody. Well, this was a very attentive and very caring and compassionate and skilled anesthesiologist. There was no, there was no deficit in their training or their skill set. But what were the system factors that caused this error? And by focusing on that, that's the direction that they went in terms of mitigating future care errors and so forth. So, just in the interest of time, we'll move to this. This actually was a slide deck that I used for external folks outside the medical commission, so you see some of this stuff in there. So I just want to remind folks what we mean by the mission of the medical commission is to promote patient safety and enhance the integrity of the profession through licensing, discipline, rulemaking, and education. Just real briefly, CRP, Communication Resolution Program, is a concept that we respond to an unanticipated outcome by communicating promptly and honestly with the patient and the family, taking responsibility immediately, not necessarily taking the blame. It's very different. Responsibility means that this is a problem that I own and I'm going to take care of with an apology. And then what steps will be taken to address the event and so forth. So this is a concept that the Washington Medical Commission has championed for many years, and probably is the only commission that actually partnered with the Foundation for Healthcare Equality to create a program, which we're going to discuss tomorrow in one of our meetings. But in terms of how this applies to what we just been talking about, error reduction and just culture principles, well, this in a healthcare setting is completely aligned with just culture and error reduction in that we openly look at the error that was created, address the system's failure, and do non-punitive investigation and proactively resolve and collaborate with the involved stakeholders and share learnings. So finally, what's our role in reduction of medical errors? So we endorse just cultural principles. I think we actually talked a little bit about this and have put into our policies just cultural principles. We also want to encourage other institutions, hospitals, and health systems to adopt the just culture. And through the actions that we take when we have cases and when we do the investigations and we have the panel consideration, to think about, is this an opportunity for us to impart our endorsement of just culture principles to the respondent and to the institution that they come from? We recognize that many human errors are systems errors when we evaluate investigations, so that when you get that email from your investigator saying, hey, I got this case with you, what do you think we should do? Think about, well, what were some of the systems factors? Let's dig into that a little bit. And was this truly malpractice or negligence, or was it a systems error? And those are things that I think we are just really starting to think about. So what the last bit here that I want to just conclude with is our job, and this reminded me of this when I was looking at one of the cases for this meeting, that there was a request for reconsideration on a case where the request for reconsideration came from the patient's family and said, this physician did me wrong, they need to pay, or they need to be accountable, as if we are, an organization that does things to make people accountable. Well, that's really not our goal. Again, going back to the mission, we're here to promote patient safety and improve the medical profession. It's not to take a respondent who made a mistake and make them feel bad about it, or make them, or force them to make reparations, or to go through some loops of saying, okay, I made a mistake, or whatever. It's to improve our profession. Nowhere in our mission does it say that we're going to take individual doctors and punish them. So we have to think about, well, was this really a violation? And I would encourage all of us to ask ourselves that question, even if the error was so egregious that you might think, oh my gosh, I would have never done that. Or that's not standard practice, or that just, or that it ended up, killing a patient. Wrong site surgery, or wrong medicine administration. That we're quick to say, okay, let's focus on the individual, let's make them pay, or let's make them, teach them a lesson and so forth. We really have to think about, well, are the errors actually a violation and do they warrant discipline? And then when we engage the respondents, we do it in a more collaborative fashion. So in fact, I was just talking to one of the SAs today that maybe our letter of the LLC, is there a way that we can make that more inclusive and collaborative so that physicians don't have that initial immediate recoil of, when they, like somebody even mentioned today, when you get a letter from the commission, that in of itself is like a punishment. You get nervous when you see that letter. And in fact, that in of itself might make you change your practice. And so how do we become more of a physician partner rather than a disciplinary body? And what entails discipline? How do respondents perceive our action? Let's think about that. We might think it's just routine letter, but how do we want to communicate so that we actually do end up reducing errors and not just making the respondent feel bad about what they did? And that, in fact, more harm than good. So I'm going to close out by sharing something very personal. So here's a mistake that I made just a month ago or so. I was backing up, and in my backup camera, there was one of those stand-up mailboxes with a sharp corner. As I was curving, it started to disappear from my view, so I assumed that I was going to be out of the way. I moved away for a second, and then next thing I know, crunch. So, admittedly, I've been driving for almost 40 years and never got into a single accident or even something like this. So, so this was a mistake that I made. Does this now mean that I have to go back to driving school, or that somehow I'm a hazard to the public and I need to be reprimanded or retrained? I mean, it's a mistake. I can blame other factors, like maybe the camera wasn't fully reliable, but of course on the camera it says don't rely on the camera. Anyway, so just wanted to throw that out there, a little bit of humor, but also real personal experience. And we'll take any questions or comments that you might have at this point. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for your lecture. I thought it was great, and I really enjoyed it before. I've been on the commission, I think, for 4 years, and there is the tension that a lot of individuals, they do see, even who are doctors as well, do have the feeling of, like, especially say there's a malpractice settlement. I just had one I presented today. I also had some learning points about it. But, and say it's related to something that happened, it's unclear exactly what happened, and the patient died. And then suddenly it's already been in a malpractice case, right? Already the individual probably feels horrible, probably knows more than anything about it, is an expert in that area. But then it comes to us, and then people will say, oh, well, we have to authorize this case, at the CMT. And to find out more, to punish the doctor, I don't know. And I just, there seems to be this feeling here. And I'm wondering, how do we change that?
I mean, that's really one of the most important questions. And we've been asking that same question for many years. As you recall, when Alden was here, the commission, we asked that same question as well. But I invite those of you here to help answer that question.
So we, Dr. Domino, one of the things, I don't sit with CMT very often these days, but when I do with med mal settlements, one of the things that I always push you guys to think about is when the actual conduct occurred, right? In the MPPB report that's there, settlement usually comes 3 or 4 years later. And one of the things I try and counsel you on is if this person doesn't have any other disciplinary history, this incident has been dealt with, and the conduct occurred 5 years ago as it wound through the civil medical malpractice system, I'm not sure what the value in looking at is. There's always extraneous factors. There's always color shades of gray and nuance. But specific to that, I do think that that's a relevant consideration. And it does go to what you were talking about, Dr. Chung, with the idea that one of our goals is to mitigate the possibility of it occurring again in the future, not necessarily punishment. And having a kind of wider lens when you look at those medical malpractice settlements is certainly something I would encourage you all to think about.
All right, and I think a lot of times we'll see like a large amount and think, well, this must be really bad. We should do something. And, I think another lesson that I would share with you all too is that we don't always have to feel like we have to do something. Just because another state or another, or a malpractice carrier did this or that, or even, law enforcement did something, it doesn't require us to also do something to make it seem like we did our job. Because just again, go back to the mission. We're here to protect the public and hold up the integrity of the profession. It's not to find people who made mistakes and fix the problem. That's not what we really need to feel compelled to do. Now, I know many of you are new. Some of you have been around long enough to know exactly what Dr. Domino was saying, that some of our even colleagues would say to us, well, we really need to teach this guy a lesson, or that kind of thing. And in fact, some people would actually say, well, I think they appreciated it, because they came for a personal appearance, and they would be very forthcoming and self-effacing and say, I really appreciate everything you've done for us. You've done for me. I learned a lot. Well, of course, they want to say that, but think of the amount of stress that they went through in their lives to get to that point. And sometimes I'll be looking back in cases that that keep coming back for personal appearances year after year, and I need to the pace and think, did we really need to do this? I mean, was this really necessary? Because we're just dragging this on, and so keep that in mind. And even though we have that feeling like, well, this guy really needs to teach them a lesson, then ask the next question: how is this going to actually change? How is this going to actually protect the public and prevent it from happening again? Knowing, going at, in most cases, when there's an error, and I'm not talking about like really bad things, where people are truly negligent or they intentionally did something bad. I'm not talking about that. But knowing that most of the time when there's an error, fixing one person is actually not going to be effective. Just knowing that. Yes, ma'am.
So I think it's important. I keyed on a couple of things what you said regarding, as a regulator, and defining or classifying the type of error that happened at, in the complaint should sort of drive whatever action the regulator takes. If it's skill-based, maybe you do need to take a backup lesson. I don't know, I'm just saying, when you're driving. So, if it's a skill-based, maybe we go.
Give me an A3 clover.
My husband is a driving instructor. I'll introduce you. Or maybe it's a rule-based error. Maybe that is where they need, some CME, or maybe they need to take a class or whatever. And then knowledge-based, maybe that is a different type of a sanction. So, maybe we need to turn our sanction or our thought process on its side and think, what kind of error happened here? and what is the best way to address that error? Because all we do, or all of the things, all the arrows we have in our quiver are a scholarly paper, CME, but maybe it's a system error and we need to work with the facility, or maybe so I think you need to actually classify the type of error and then look at that and say, what can we do to make that better based on the type of error that was made, and not just look at everything and have it be the same.
Yeah, no, the thing is that what you said is really important, which is that to actually prevent errors, it takes more than that one person. It might actually require a collaborative effort with facilities or multiple factors, like, creating teams instead of individual practices and those kind of things. Because a lot of the skills and knowledge-based errors can be prevented by having somebody with you to say, hey, wait, before you do that. And in practice, people do that. Nurses have that two-way double check kind of thing, and physicians are supposed to get second opinions and ask for help. That's kind of what they teach us. But nonetheless, it would be a great opportunity if we were able to, let's say, hey, we've identified a systems practice, facilities, can you help us communicate with the hospital as well and come up with a better solution? But I don't know if we're even close to that point.
What you presented here is very resonant with, people in the room to think about the same type of mindset. But we also have the interface with the public. So I'm just wondering, this is 3 different types of errors. If somehow we could also communicate with the patient families and funders about how we view the error. That will be also a good process to make the public understand the rationale behind the action that commission will be taking.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's part of what CRP tries to do, which is be open to the patient's families and also to the public when a mistake or error has been made, to be able to, we're not going to go into the room and be very academic about it. We're not going to say, oh, this was a category 3 or whatever. We're going to just explain to them this is how things happen, and help them understand and help them find a solution together. So I think that's part of what the efforts under CRP is about.
Thank you. How should the regulator think about skill-based errors that are related to bias and equity? Just hearing some of the cases and imagining future cases, concern around language competency, body size, ethnicity, other types of bias might be a concern that would inform the compliance concerns, even though the actual medical care that was delivered was not substandard.
Well, I will say we have a new focus on diversity and discrimination as part of the investigatory investigational work. And maybe Melanie can comment a little bit on that. But you bring up a really difficult topic for us, which is it would be great if we had the tools to be able to educate without it being punitive. So when we say punitive, it means that something goes on the record. If we do a STID or take any kind of action, it goes into the data bank, it goes into FSME. Everybody knows about it. Beyond less than that, we don't have the ability to say, okay, we'd like you to do this. And we can send an A3 letter and say, we think this is important, period. But we can't say, you should do this without actually implementing something like us did. And so we're sort of, I think, restricted in terms of even topics like implicit bias and so forth. How do we get, because, they're not trying, I don't think physicians are trying to make mistakes based on biases. It's just, it happens. But with training, they can avoid those errors, right? But how do we get them to get the training without taking action? That's the challenge. Takes literally an act of action. All right, Mike, I feel like you want to say something. You haven't lived on your days. Well, thank you, everybody. And I want to make sure that this is not a one-time thing. I'm not saying that we're going to have this conversation every month, but this will be a common theme for a lot of the discussions we'll be having in the future in terms of how we reassess our processes and look at the different ways that we can do things differently and better. And then every once in a while, we'll continue to maybe revisit some of the topics that I brought up. Also, just so you know, the Reduction of Medical Errors Committee that I referred to actually has been renamed now Higher Reliability Organization Committee, which work group, which I'm going to meet tomorrow. So if you're interested after your personal appearances, you can drop by. Christine's, is it Christine or is it Dr. Domino chairing that? Dr. Domino is going to chair it, and Mike is our staff for that committee. So that committee is going to continue to look at different ways that we can implement some of these error reduction methods. Thank you very much.
Good talk, Jimmy. No, I think it's following him.